the impact of the mega drought in the Western U.S. on food supply chains. Topic of my discussion today with Phil Renaud. He is Executive Director of the Risk Institute at The Ohio State University. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for sharing your podcast with me today.
And thanks for joining me. As if the pandemic weren't enough, as if economic recession weren't enough, we have a drought in the Western United States, which seems extremely persistent. And of course, it's going to have a direct impact on food supply chains. But I'd like to hear from you. What are some of the observations that you've seen with regard to food supply, availability, consumer buying behavior? What are the big takeaway points that you're seeing right now as a result of this particular event?
Yeah, I think, Bob, it's a very, very interesting conversation, because if we look back at buying behaviors during COVID, we think about the early onset of COVID. How did people react? They ran to the supermarkets to buy toilet paper and other commodities, hand sanitizer, et cetera, to gear up. If we think about just a couple of weeks ago with the behavior, and I was talking with a friend of mine in North Carolina earlier today, the Colonial Pipeline. North Carolina created a state of emergency. What was the immediate behavior? The immediate behavior was run to the filling stations and fill up your car.
Always.
He was talking about people running in with trash bags and filling up trash bags with fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this panic buying behavior that seems to have kind of emerged during COVID. So our thinking now is with the drought, and that's serious because we've experienced the worst temperature change since the 1880s. If you think about that, that's massive. And what's the impact on crops? So we've got strawberries and we've got almonds and we've got all sorts of different crops that are originated in the west coast of the U.S. Does now that suddenly mean that I need to change my supply chain for those crops to Europe or Latin America or Canada or other areas that may not be experiencing those severe droughts? So not only do we have this panic buying scenario that people are saying, well, strawberries are going to be short supply, so therefore I'm going to buy as many as I can. The challenge with food, though, is it wastes.
Yeah, you can't keep them around that long.
Gasoline, I can't keep it in my garage and, for the time space that I need it, or hand sanitizer. Food's going to waste. So I need to kind of gear up and make sure that I've got a supply for that week's family needs. Right. So it creates a whole different kind of set of dynamics that we in society today are very used to, just in time, right? And we've done a very, very good job of that in the supply chain to create this just-in-time process. As things like dependency on food supplies from certain areas of the country, that will always challenge us, or will continue to challenge us going forward.
Now, this is interesting because certainly we saw panic buying in the early weeks and months of the pandemic, but that sort of tapered off a little bit as people realized that grocery stores were not going to close, that the food was going to be there, and we got back to what might be considered somewhat normal levels of grocery buying, more than usual because so many people were at home, maybe, I don't know. But you're saying now that there's enough of a public awareness of this drought that might spark a new round of panic buying on the food side?
I mean, it could. I mean, there's no guarantees there, but you look at the behavior of people. This Colonial Pipeline, for example, while it's not food, it demonstrates the panic buying that exists today. So people's tendencies and behaviors seem to be changing based upon the news cycles that are out there. So suddenly we realize that it was not a supply problem in Colonial, right? It was not a supply problem.
Yeah.
It was, in effect, a supply chain problem. Why? Because driver shortages, couldn't get enough drivers in the seats to get the product to the filling stations. So we create our own sense of emergency, our own sense of panic here by governors, in the case of North Carolina, creating a state or a state of emergency. So the reaction of the buying public is, oh, there's got to be something much worse than what I'm seeing. Therefore, my reaction is panic buying.
Psychological for sure.
It's
Yeah.
psychological.
Now, I'm also wondering if, as the economy opens up, and specifically as restaurants begin doing business again, will there be an even greater need for food? I mean, there's X amount of food that people can purchase, and maybe they were buying more of it, for their homes before. But
Mhm.
will that put more pressure on the food supply chain as restaurants start needing it too?
It likely will result in that because we've had this sense of or this reality that the food we'd buy was for our own consumption. So we'd go to whatever food location we're buying from, delivered to the home,
Hmm.
not going out to restaurants. We have this sense of, and I saw it today in the last couple of days, where people are anxious. They're anxious to get out. They're anxious to socialize. They're
Yeah.
anxious to meet their friends and relatives in restaurants and other areas where they gather. So that's likely to push the demand up for products that are supplied primarily from West Coast destinations.
Hmm. Another thing is, though, I think that a lot of food supply chains are well, especially on the produce side, are well accustomed to drawing from multiple sources as needed. Like off season, you can get
Correct.
berries and things on the West Coast from Chile and South America and Mexico. And then during the season, you get it from up here. They shift all the time. So I'm thinking in that area, is it that much of a challenge to shift sourcing in
Well, it
response
could
to the
be.
drought?
It could be because if suddenly one of our primary sources is not there, and
Yeah.
we have to then go back to, I'll call it tier two, tier three suppliers, and the demand for tier two, tier three now is tier one, then what does that mean? It means that we may not have the capacity in that tier two, tier three supplier network to meet the demands of the wider needs.
Right. Right. And certainly there's plenty of agriculture elsewhere in the United States, but that doesn't mean that they are well positioned to suddenly start serving the West because they're serving their own customers regionally. So,
Well, correct,
yeah.
correct. And, with I mean, if you look at Lake Mead, for example, I think it's down to proportions that have never been seen since
Hmm.
the day it was built. Um, those crops may not get the necessary water supply. They may not be able to get it because of the situation at Lake Mead. So it just exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, there is a unprecedented nature to some of this. You talked about temperatures not seen since the 1880s and the like, but we've also had here in the Western United States, we've had a series of droughts that come and go or seem to come and go. Are there lessons we can draw on the past in order to how to deal with this current situation, or are we in completely new territory here now?
I think, I'd like to say there are lessons we can draw from the past, but I think we're in new territory. If
Ah.
we look at not only, and I want to talk about the wider climate change here rather than
Hmm.
just singular droughts. If we look at the impact of increased frequency and severity of storms, we look at floods in Houston.
Hmm.
We look at the number of named storms that have impacted the Gulf in the east coast of the U.S. So we've got this this kind of growth in a pattern of extreme weather events
Hmm.
that are causing other challenges. So, for example, while my crops may be challenged on the West Coast because of drought conditions, I may have situations in other parts of the country, let's say the Midwest or Southeast, where I've got an overabundance of water and therefore my fields are not as productive as they have been because I've got an oversupply of water, right? So either way, there's a challenge and a balance that needs to occur.
I'm not hearing much in the way of solutions here, and I'm not suggesting that you should have them. But other than shifting sourcing on a need to basis, um, what can we do to prepare for these changing weather patterns, if anything, when with regard to the food supply?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need as a society, global society. I'm not talking about U.S. society, as a global society, understand the impacts of fossil fuels, other things that are
Right.
impacting our it was interesting because if you look at some geospatial mapping and you look at during the pandemic, during COVID, on a global basis, and you look at some major cities like LA and that Chicago, Boston, New York, where the disruption in those particular areas of number of vehicles on the road, and you see how quickly things turned around in a more positive basis. It was quite, you know, energizing to me to look at that and say, we can turn this around. We've got to take some immediate actions, and we've got to think globally on how we can reduce fossil fuel kind of impact to our society.
Yeah.
You know, it does tend to cleanse itself, and we saw that just in the short period of time where vehicles were off the road during COVID pandemic. It cleansed itself pretty quickly.
And it
So,
also gives companies a newfound awareness of the importance of working risk management into their supply chains, hence the existence
right.
of the Risk Institute and similar organizations. We're happy to have you, Phil,
Thank you.
helping us to figure these things out. Phil Renaud, The Ohio State University. Great to talk to you. Always great to talk to you. Thanks for your insights into this, what appears to be an intractable problem, but maybe not. Not if we set forward to devise some solutions right pretty quickly. But thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. Have
Take
a
care.
great day.